Hello everyone, as you might have noticed, a new patch just dropped for EVE Online titled From Wormholes with Love. As such, myself, Jin'Taan, and Suitonia, two veterans of both the game and the CSM, have decided to sit down and talk about the patch as we normally do in our Patch Notes podcast. But because this is such a patch that is focused on wormholes, we didn't think it was quite right for us to go through it on our own. Instead, we invited two veterans of the Wormhole community, Loroseco.
Hi there.
And uMillenium.
Hey there.
To tag along with us and really help give us some depth when it comes to what's happened in this patch and how it's really impacted Wormhole gameplay. So, Suitonia, what's the first thing we're going to be talking about today?
Sure, so we're going to be going down through the patch notes. We might jump down a little bit to deal with some wormhole changes. But to begin with, we're going to talk about the fact that CCP has increased wandering wormhole connections. So that's excluding ferret and the shattered wormholes. So every normal wormhole will now connect more often to other wormholes through dynamic connections. Those are non-static wormholes that if they get rolled, they disappear. The wandering C5 and C6 connections to nullsec have also had their presence increased too, so you'll find a lot more nullsec holes in C5 and C6 space. And there's also more wandering connections specifically for C4, C5, and C6 wormhole systems.
Yeah, and you'll notice something pretty quickly here, which is that CCP likes to be very, very vague whenever they make changes to wormholes. And increased and changed, introduced. These are all terms that don't really mean that much. So, Loroseco, uMillenium, can you give us some idea of just how much this has increased the connectivity in wormholes for wormhole players?
So,
go ahead.
So the issue with trying to quantify the numbers this close to the patch is how the roaming wormholes work. They don't spawn until somebody has warped to them, and then they're not going to despawn for a few more hours. So we're quite close to the patch to get accurate numbers. Currently, as far as nullsec are concerned, currently it feels like there are even less than there were previously. Like I think we scanned 30 or 40 C5s yesterday, and we got maybe 1 or 2 nullsecs, where before we were getting 1 every 4 or 5 wormholes. So I'm gonna hold my opinion on that. But the C5 and the C6 wandering connections, on the other hand, we don't scan many C4s. The C5 and C6 wanderings are just everywhere. There's 3 or 4 per system, which is ridiculous. So you pop a wormhole and there's 5 or 6 connections off it, and then each of those has another 3 or 4 connections, or however many. It's ridiculous.
Compared to how it was before this patch, just to give some impression for those of us like me who have no idea what the hell goes on in wormhole space.
So before this patch, the only wandering wormholes at all, I believe, were from lower class leading up to higher class. So sometimes you'd get wormholes from C5s or C6s leading down to C1s, 2s, and 3s, but there were none connecting high class holes to each other. If you had a C5 and a C5 directly connected, that was a static wormhole. There's only 1 static per system. So connectivity between the high class corps, the people who live in C5 space, was a lot lower. And when you scanned out a chain, it'd be very long and narrow. So you'd jump into your C5 static, you'd scan around, there might be one wandering, but it would just be the next static, and you'd keep going down, and you'd get sort of a long, narrow chain. Now it's wide, it's like a web. You might have heard of the C5 highway if you've ever talked to wormholers, where you just could sort of keep scanning this long chain of C5s. It's a C5 spider's web now.
Yeah, in Goryn, we've had basically the same experience in regards to no. There's like absolutely none of them at all. The frequency has definitely gone down. But C5s and C6s, we get about 5 to 10 connections per C6 especially. It feels like there's a lot more C6 incoming holes than there are actually C6s in the game right now. So you kind of get this weird experience where you basically get a C6 that's just connected to everywhere.
No, I think you're right. So this is based on the numbers that me and my corp have gathered. We're gonna lowball here, just so I'm not blowing the stats out of proportion. On average, we'll say 1 C5 and 1 C6 connection per C5 wormhole is about what we found. It's actually a little more than that in reality, but let's just keep it lower. And there's 500 C5s in the game. And if each wormhole has these 2 extra wanderings, then that means that each C5 has 1 extra wandering wormhole. But there's only 100 C6s. So if there's 500 extra C6 wanderings leading into C6 space, into 100 systems, it means that C6 wormholes have 5 times as many wandering connections as before. And that's not counting any of the wandering wormholes that are now appearing in C4 space, or any of the ones that are in C6 space itself. And
yeah, just take a peek at Pathfinder right now. You have C6s that just branch out to so many wormholes that we can't physically fit them in the map right now. Basically, it's to the point that you cannot actually scan these.
a lot of wormhole bookmark schemes that Corps use are sort of based on the long winding chains, and people have started to talk about how to make them a little bit better, adapting to the web. So there's some discussion. There's some very good advantages and not so great disadvantages about the sheer number of wormholes we're looking at. The advantages, of course, instead of the long narrow chains, we have the short wide chains, which means when you find content in chain, on average, the content is closer to your home. When you find a hostile wormhole corp in chain, they are closer to your home. Both groups are closer to each other. Both groups are using the same wormhole chains for logistics and for PvE, and they're bumping into each other a lot more. And the fights are a lot more likely to happen because there's less wormhole separating them. And obviously, each wormhole is limited by mass. And if there's less wormholes between you and your enemy, there's less chances to hit a low mass wormhole and to not be able to fight as effectively as you want to. So as far as purely PvP groups bumping into each other, it's a huge positive. Its connectivity is going to be a lot better. The disadvantage is unfortunately on the PvE side, and it is comparable, i.e. not as bad as Blackout, where all of this extra connectivity means that PvEers don't feel safe in their wormholes, especially C6 dwellers. As a disclaimer, I own a C6. I am biased here. I won't try and hide that, but I now know that I'm going to get 5 times as many roaming wormholes. And for those of you who don't know, a roaming wormhole only spawns into your wormhole once someone has walked to it and jumped it. So if I'm sat in my C6, there might be 5 or 6 roaming wormholes that are connected to me that just haven't been jumped yet. And other wormhole players know this, so when they find a wandering C6 in their chain, they preform with sabers and whatnot, and sabers in an armor fleet, and they could come in and kill you. So for me personally, I'm a bit of a coward when it comes to my PvE ships. I've not touched them since the patch. I don't think I'm going to touch them for the rest of the week, just because I don't really want to log in anymore while everybody's running around. Just with it's too much connectivity. We all wanted more, but the amount they've put in is absurd. It needs to be toned down somewhat.
I'm in the absolute same boat regarding my PvE setup. Right now, it just doesn't make sense for me to log in by, especially when I could alternatively just run, let's say, a subcap Reshak setup. You can, for instance, just grab the scrams down and be safe most of the time. Of course, you still run the risk of getting rolled into in the time you're scrammed. But let's say you're sieged essentially for like 2 minutes at a time in your subcaps. And at most, you'll lose 1 if you get rolled into, which is just much worse content overall.
Roll back again a little bit and just explain how this worked previously. Like, you mentioned safety, and I was always under the impression that Wormhole PvE was at least moderately dangerous. What is the change really? How has this altered the equation for you to introduce more risk?
So I'll talk about C6 as that's sort of the only perspective I've had in the past year. It's been a while since I've done C5 PvE. I warp into site with my however many Dreadnaughts you use. It's between 1 and 6, depending on who you talk to. And I run the sites. Before I do that, I would be rolling all of the connecting wormholes. The rate of incoming C6 connections was fairly low. Usually it's obviously your static going out, and then it would be some wandering K spaces leading to low sec or high sec. And if somebody connected to you, it would be through a static. So you'd have some groups living in C5s with C6 statics specifically to roll the static into C6 space. So it was a little bit on the safe side, admittedly. However, because there's only 100 C6 wormholes, if there is a group rage rolling C6s, it does not take that long to run into somebody, assuming it's a fairly active time zone. So for example, before the change, I would not undock my dreads in EU time zone because there's so few C6 systems, and there's at least 1 or 2 EU time zone rolling corps that are active basically every day. it's not worth the risk. I'd only PvE on days where I can afford to stay up to sort of past midnight. So I'm on Eve time. I'm British, so I'm sort of after that sort of time. Now there's roaming connections everywhere in C5 and C6 space post-patch. So just a casual US time zone corp scanning their chain, they're going to find a roaming C6 and jump it, and they're going to connect to me in early US time zone, which we did need more of that. C6s were a little bit too isolated, but it's too extreme. There's as many roaming connections to C6 space as there are to C5 space, even though there's only a fifth of the number of C6 systems. And in my opinion, the number that are connecting to C5 space is a little bit high. That's sort of my opinion, so that's debatable, but I think that's high. And then C6 is there's 5 times as many per system. It just needs tweaking. It's a good change. The numbers were off, in my opinion.
Idea how this has impacted C5 ratting as well, as opposed to just purely C6 ratting?
Well, C5s are a lot more impacted by the PvE changes that we're going to get down to later, but those plus a combination of these wandering changes, they have impacted C5 not as badly as C6 because there's less roaming connections per C5, but still to a reasonable degree. It is a lot less profitable and a lot less safe now in C5 space. I would say a little bit too dangerous with all of these changes coming at once, and especially with no warning. I really dislike how there was just no warning for gutting people's income like this. But it's not as bad as C6, it's just because there's less wanderings.
Even prior to the patch, personally, I thought C5 ratting was pretty risky. It was not, super safe, considering so many groups actively rage roll for C5s. If you go to do, let's say, a Dreadnought setup in a C5, it's so much more risky.
A Dreadnought, yeah, absolutely. If you've got a Dreadnought siege in a site, I'm talking about those MJD rattlesnake bear holes you'd run into where they'd kill the Drifter with the Astro House. If you have a Drifter in a 5 site, these changes have done very little to you besides the increase in wandering connections. So it is a fair bit more dangerous for you now, but nothing on the scale of Dread ratting in C6 space. That's far more dangerous nowadays than C5.
For the C5 players that just ran their rattlesnakes, it was completely safe for them.
Yeah, literally.
It definitely needed to change.
You couldn't even spot botters that were doing it either, because the botters would behave quite similarly to real players. If you wanted to spot a botter, you would have to leave an ult behind in their wormhole and roll it off and commit it to that wormhole for a couple of days, just to work out if the rattlesnake farmers were bots or not. It wasn't like nullsec where you can spot them as soon as you went to local.
You talked a little bit about the nullsec connections feeling like they were less, but can you elaborate that on a little more? Is going from like C5s and trying to hunt people in Brock Wars and things like that just not viable anymore, or was that ever viable to begin with? I don't claim to be an expert here.
It was viable to begin with. As of right now, from my conjecture, it doesn't seem to be viable, but it is definitely unintended. They have said in black and white here that the connections to nullsec have increased, and it simply hasn't. So whatever's going on behind the scenes, it's some sort of bug. It's unintended. And also, what I said earlier about the figures that we've been finding might not be necessarily accurate, because wormholes need to be warped to and spawned and then rolled again. Sort of the way the server handles wormhole RNG is a little bit weird. So we might just need 3 or 4 days for everything to cycle around and for us to get the numbers that we're expecting. So maybe there's no bug and we just need to wait a couple of days. Maybe somebody put a decimal point in the wrong place and we're getting 1% rate of nullsec rather than 10%. We don't know, but hopefully we'll know by the end of the week.
Do you think that adding more connections would be good though? I'm curious there.
Yes, definitely. Well, again, I live in a C5 with a C5 static. My nullsec content comes purely from these wandering connections, so an increase is a good thing. They were nerfed back in around 2015, I believe, because groups like Pandemic Legion were using wormhole chains to traverse huge areas of nullsec to get to strategic timers. Nowadays, firstly, Ansiblex jump gates are in the game, which, frankly, if CCP are okay with them, then there's nothing wrong with a wormhole chain that actually takes effort to scan out every day. And secondly, with everybody running super capitals for home defense and capitals and being able to field them for defensive timers, being able to move 100 or so sub capitals across space after scanning a wormhole chain, it's not a big deal anymore. So the nerf didn't need to still be in place.
I'd also like to add, we have these drifter wormholes now for these small cons that people field nowadays, Stukas, Kikis, that kind of stuff. And those have how many nullsec connections? Like 30, right? So,
I think those count.
yeah, it's so much that you're bottlenecked by the amount you can scan. So just roaming C5 connections to nullsec is not going to affect anything anymore.
Like the amount of groups, like uMillenium's corp lives in a C2 with a nullsec static, so he can just rage roll his nullsec static for content. So just giving C5 residents a couple of extra roaming wormholes, you're just going to see hard knocks around a little bit more than you did before. There's not going to be many other changes.
Yeah, you guys have mentioned the term rage rolling a fair amount here, and it's just occurred to me that some people in the audience might not know what that means. Do you mind just explaining that from your perspective as well?
Yeah, sure. So when a wormhole has a static wormhole, say I live in a C5 with a C5 static, when I roll my static C5, about a minute later, another wormhole will spawn, leading to another random C5. And then when I roll that one, another one spawns. uMillenium lives in a system with a nullsec static. So if he wants to, say, hunt in Delve today, he goes to his wormhole, sees it's not Delve, and then he'll put enough mass through the wormhole with rolling battleships until the wormhole collapses, and he'd keep doing that. And you can roll wormholes about every between 2 and 5 minutes, depending on how quick you are. And that's called rage rolling, sort of repeatedly rolling wormholes to get to a specific location.
Like a fleet prepared whilst you're doing that, right?
Yeah, it depends on what group. Some our guys are a little bit lazy, so sometimes you'll have sort of 3 or 4 people online with a couple of sabers, and they'll start spam pinging if they catch anything. I know a couple of groups, Dead Terrorists come to mind, a C3 nullsec corp. They have sort of a Tuesday night fleet where they ping the whole corp and have a 50-man fleet running around rage rolling. Different groups do that different ways.
Yeah, the normal way first as well is to just have a few people who are dedicated to hunting at the time to just try tackle stuff, bait out a fight, and then we ping for an actual.
Yeah, that seems to be the more common way. But people like Dead Terrorists and Inner Hell as well, they'll do a preformed fleet, and if they roll into a system, they'll have 30 to 80 people, depending on the size of the corp, out there immediately on the target. And you can't do that with the Wanderings. You can't predict when they spawn. So it doesn't do any harm compared to other methods of using wormholes and things like Ansiblexes and, of course, Drifter wormholes.
All right, so do you guys have anything more to say on the connection changes, or can we move down to the PvE ones?
Yeah, I've also experienced like a decrease in low sec and high sec connections in my chain. It's been increasingly difficult the past day to find logistics holes for our corp, because that's what the majority of our scanning is for.
I think that may be just because you're having to scan more wormholes per system. It may feel like it's taking you longer.
That's our theory, but we've had like holes, like we've had like a 10 deep chain yesterday, and we had no high sec. It's really not fun in this department.
I've not noticed that. I think the RNG is just a little weird right now because they've added all these new wormholes. So we'll give it a week and see how we feel back then. See how we feel then.
Yeah.
That's the problem with wormholes, is that they are very spooky places, and a lot of it is so RNG dependent that you can't really get a good grip on things until you have time to really generate a lot of data.
We are slowly working it out, slowly but surely.
As all good EVE players do whenever a CCP makes a change. Well, then I guess we get to the missions and NPC changes, where there are just 2 lines of text here, which is updated drifter response battleship behaviors, and updated some sleeper warp scramblers to shut off micro jump drives. Why don't we go for that first one first? First of all, what is the drifter response battleship, and how has its behaviors been changed?
So before the Citadel patch in 2016, when you warped capitals into a wormhole site, you'd spawn this very powerful battleship wave where it'd drop a bunch of loot. CCP decided to move all that value to a final boss in these sites, which is the Drifter. You finish the site, and then a structure decloaks. You shoot the structure, and then the Drifter spawns. This Drifter, if you then warp away, this Drifter will bounce around your wormhole. It used to warp to planets. It warps to wormholes. It can warp to some anomalies. And what people used to do, they would run the site in very safe MJD rattlesnakes that could just leave at a moment's notice. They'd get to the Drifter, pop it, and then immediately warp off. And they would have an Astro House sitting on one of the planets, and they would wait for the Drifter to move around to that planet. It might take a few hours, but they'd anchor a bubble on the planet so it caught once it got there. And then they would bait the Drifter over to the Astro House and tackle it there and kill it with the Astro House. The most impactful change is drifters no longer warp to planets. So killing drifters with astro houses no longer works. It's a very impactful change. It means that if people want to get the maximum income from C5 sites, they either need to commit a reasonably large subcapital fleet, not too large anymore because of Lashak DPS, but like they need to put decently tanked, well-fit battleships on the field to kill them, or they need to commit capitals. So that is, as far as content goes, that's quite a good change. It's a necessary change in my opinion, because I've always thought it ridiculous that you can get the maximum payout from a high-class site without putting capitals on field. That was the whole point of capital escalations in the old days. So now you finally have to actually commit something to field to get the maximum payout. And it messes up a lot of people's income, and I do think they should have got advance warning, but the change itself is good. It just should have been communicated a couple of weeks ago. I think that's my main issue with this patch. The PvE things that I've talked about with the Wandering Connections, they're just numbers. They can be tweaked down if CCP see an issue. But the fact that some people's income has just disappeared overnight with zero announcement. The patch notes came out after the patch, which seems to be a habit of CCPs the last 3 or 4 months. And when you're messing with people's income, like C5 Astra farming is some people's primary source of income, it just should have been communicated.
Right, and you mentioned that people have to bring a lot more ISK onto the field now. Before, the comps that people were running these sites in were mostly MJD rattlesnakes, right? There was also some Nesters and Dominixes and sometimes like remote repair Lashaks, right? As I understand.
The way these comps worked is the drifters would not scram you. They would only essentially warp disrupt you. So the way you secure your hull, you'd roll every connection, and then you can see in your probe scanner, if someone rolls into you, you'll get a red signature up on the probe scanner before anyone actually rolls system. So with these comps, you could MJD whatever's tackled and just warp off before anyone runs on grid. So these comps essentially had no risk whatsoever to be fielded.
That sounds kind of like local.
It is.
So there is a big difference to local. I should have pointed this out when I was on the meta show, and I did essentially say that it was local, which to an extent, yes, it is. But if somebody has seeded your system while you're asleep and then they log in to watch you and choose the ideal time to come in and interrupt your PvE, say just as the drifter spawns and you're under the most pressure, that's the main difference to local. That's what makes Wormhole PvE a little bit more dangerous. If someone's sat in your hull watching, waiting for you to do something, you have no idea.
So it would be kind of like if you could see Gatefire throughout the entire system. It wouldn't provide you perfect information about who's in that system, but only people are going into it. Okay, yeah, that's a good distinction to make.
Yeah, that's absolutely how it works.
You can also use it kind of like how you'd use like a spy in a nullsec alliance, right? Like as soon as a carrier warps to the next anomaly, then you jump your sabers in. Although you need to know that you have a hole to that, like a connection to that specific hole beforehand. Yeah.
To that extent, the difference being, I don't need to go through if I want to seed someone's wormhole, I don't need to have to get into their corp. Say if I want to seed somebody with fairly high requirements to get into their corp, or maybe they have a specific PvE corp where they don't let anyone else in, I'm not going to look suspicious in that system like I might do in some of the more private nullsec renting systems. It's I don't have to take those steps if I want to watch somebody in wormhole sites. So it is a fair bit easier to be able to scout people and gather intel in wormhole space.
You also don't really need to see much at all to kill, let's say, a dread ratting setup or a rattlesnake ratting setup. For rattles, you'll need a handful of bombers at most. And for dreads, you can get away with like 2 phoenixes and just wipe any setup.
You can wipe a rattlesnake setup with a single frigate. You can do it with a kitsune. Because the rattlesnakes rely on transferring capacitors to each other to tank the sleepers because they have so much tank. They're so cap dependent. So if you warp in a kitsune and get a good jam off, you can just kill rattlesnakes. But if they're on the ball, then they'll see you pop up on grid and they could MJD away for safety. They could before the second point on this list, which we're getting to in a second. But yeah, Dreadnaughts, the usual thing that you would see to kill a Dreadnought setup would be 2 or 3 Phoenixes. And that's because of the torpedo. Firstly, you can sit sort of 70 or 80 kilometers off the dreads with Phoenix range rigs, so that the PvE dreads just couldn't shoot back. And secondly, Phoenix Alpha is enough to kill most dreadfits, because active tank dreads in wormhole space, they don't have any buffer. They've got cap batteries and target painters and such. They just die instantly.
Yeah, a wormhole dread typically has at most 10k raw DPS tank and like 250k EHP. It's an absolute joke to just kill them with an actual dread.
Are there any preferred wormhole types for farming C5s and C6s?
Wow.
Like, obviously, Magnetar is probably the best one for dreads. But is there any preference for things like rattlesnakes?
There are actually two, in my opinion, that are better for dreads than Magnetar. One of them is the Red Giant because of its bonus to smart bomb damage, which means that all of those frigates just evaporate to a single smart bomb fitted to your dread. It can take an entire siege cycle off your site depending on which site you're running. And the second one that's better is a Pulsar, because a Pulsar gives you a capacitor bonus, which is so high that you can leave your shield booster on and forget about it. You don't have to fit as many capacitor mid slots. You can fit more target painters and more tracking computers. And that can actually lead to a situation where you're running sites faster in a Pulsar or a Red Giant than in a Magnetar, because you have the damage bonus in a Magnetar, but it comes with a tracking penalty, which has a huge effect on Horde guns.
As you alluded to just a couple of seconds ago, the other major change in this update is the fact that Sleeper, what was previously the warp disruption from the Sleepers, has now been changed to be a proper warp scramble effect, so that micro jump drives are taken offline for, or at least aren't usable for a certain amount of time within the site. What kind of a vulnerability window does that bring in? Are we talking about 1 minute out of 10 you're going to be vulnerable, or is this like whilst you're doing the site you're going to be able to be caught?
It entirely depends on what comp you're running. If you're running a super high DPS, high multi-box comp, you can very quickly alpha these scrams in most. Some waves have, for instance, Guardian battleships, which have an absurd amount of EHP, but the majority have their scrams on frigates, cruisers, or at worst, a Sentinel battleship, which has about 140k EHP. However, if you're on just a typical rattlesnake comp you'd use for the old Astros farming, you're basically there forever.
Some of the sleepers that scram are going to be the triggers for the next wave of the site, and if you trigger the next wave early, it's going to be too much DPS for some comps to handle, so you can't clear scrams in some cases. However, there are some flaws to this patch. The first one is that the sleeper scrams don't stop mobile micro jump units, so you can anchor a 3 million ISK micro jump unit in your 500 million ISK site, and the only vulnerability window is the minute that it takes to anchor at the start of your 20-minute site. So you're 95% safe instead of 100% safe. And the second issue is MJD destroyers. If somebody rolls into your wormhole, you can warp an MGD destroyer down to your fleet, and as long as they don't scram the MGD destroyer itself, everyone else gets jumped off regardless of whether they're scrammed or not. So the intent behind this was going to be impactful. As it stands, this change does very little. I'm hoping that this is a bug. Well, I'm certain that it's a bug. I'm hoping that it gets fixed, which, considering sleepers should have scrammed and they haven't for 4 years, Talos have been good at iteration. Well, they've been good at doing regular patch notes so far. They've not had anything to iterate on yet. I hope they do something here.
Yep. These bugs regarding MJD destroyers and scrams, there's a bunch more in the game that are pretty easy to find out. It seems that all the MJDs have a different effect type in the game's code, and when CCP add a new scram, for instance, it will only affect a certain number of them. Seems like something they forget quite often.
Alright, do we have any more kind of comments about these PvE changes? Is there anything that isn't listed here that's ended up impacting things? Other than obviously the connectivity changes.
Drifters aggress quite differently. I don't know if uMillenium's run into any
they switch targets now.
So for me personally in the Dreadnaughts, that does absolutely nothing for me. I'm wondering if it's different for you. It makes no change at all to how I run the sites.
Not for me either, because I use a Dread.
Okay, that's fair enough. I just wanted to check. I don't think there's anything else PvE related that I can think of in that case.
Alright, well, with that, let's just get back to the main patch notes. There are a couple of things that aren't particularly important for at least us talking about, like Nirvana's being slightly more available now because they're available in the loyalty point store of Sancha, which is a nice boon to all those people who were stockpiling loyalty points and hoping that those would be the first place they'd be available, so they'd be able to take advantage of that initial market demand. I gotta say, I actually really like the way CCP is taking care of that initial burst of demand by just seeding them in sites that people actually have to log on to and run at the time of release. I think that's generally a pretty solid change to the way they're releasing new items. It allows them to see how they are being applied and check to make sure they're not going to be like ridiculously overpowered before seeding them en masse. We also have the old slave implants, which have now been renamed to amulets, but literally everyone is going to continue calling them slaves for at least 2 years, have been moved to the Blood Raider loyalty point store and loot tables.
This is a great change for us. Doesn't this mean they're going to be super cheap because goons are going to farm them to death now?
Oh, yeah.
Actually,
Well, it depends, right? Because most of the LP source comes from burner farmers, and Blood Raiders kind of suck because they only have 4 level 4s, whereas with Sanchez, you have like one system that has like 8 level 4 agents in it, so kind of ridiculous.
Does this also mean that they're in the Blood Raider loot tables and such, and they drop into ED sites? I don't really know how all of that works. I think implants drop in sort of general PvE sites.
They do.
Yeah, so with any luck, goons will find a way to farm them to death regardless, which is great for wormholes because we have, I think most wormholes, especially in high class, own a set of amulets, and we lose them very regularly.
So
the current Blood Raider implants are talismans, right?
yes,
I believe so. Yeah,
believe those are relatively cheap right now.
they are.
Yeah.
So we'll probably see a slow decrease in slave costs then. But that's also because talismans are fucking shit and no one uses them.
I have a set of
They're
high
not
grades.
bad,
Thank you.
but
Niche. I shouldn't say shit, but they're very niche.
They're very niche, yes.
we both have a set of high grades.
I might have a mid grade Omega because I'm a cheapskate, but I do have high grade the rest.
Just for the like 7 newt fit Balgon, right? With probably blinged out newts. And that's to take out faxes.
4 newts, 3 nauses. It's for... Okay, that's a whole different conversation. We'll be here all day if we get into that.
I mean, yeah, sorry, you can't newt out a fax.
Not just for faxes. For other things as well, but we'll be here all day if we get into that.
Yeah.
Like Lashaks, but yeah.
Spicy. Yeah, we'll talk about that some other time, maybe. I'll have to have you on and you can talk about the Wormhole PvP meta someday.
Oh boy.
But yeah, then we get to the real meaty one, which is the new Savior implant set. And this is not been seeded yet, but it will start being seeded tomorrow if we get this video out today, ? And basically on the February the 13th, to those of you listening. And effectively what it does is it's going to reduce the remote rep cycle time of all remote reps that are not capital sized. This is interesting because it is something that benefits armor a little more than shield, which I always like. Decreases the lag time between reps being activated and them actually impacting the ship you're targeting. But in general, what it just does is increase the EHP a second of all remote reps.
It also increases the cap a second as well, though. So it increases your throughput, but it also increases the cost.
Increase the cost. You're still repping the same amount per cap you use.
Or if you cycle it, yeah. But you're going to use more cap per second if you want to use the advantage of the Savior set.
Sure.
The cap penalty has been quite an issue in my theory crafting because a lot of our logi fits are very close to capping out. This is probably way different for the high class wormhole meta, but all these nano logi fits are very iffy on the cap, to put it lightly. So it's got to be a hard sell over snakes, but it's got to be a good implant set, I think. It's just got to be very...
So I don't think we'll use these at all. Because there's the 2 Logi ships. At first glance, these look really good for the Zarm and like okay for the Guardian. And to just break down those 2 ships individually, the Zarm, obviously this means that it spools up faster. But one of the costs of the faster activation time and the larger activation cost is you want to be able to switch off on and off the rep to try and micromanage your capacitor, so you're not just burning through all your capacitor immediately with the faster cycle time. And that means that a Zarm isn't going to be able to spool while at the same time being able to manage its capacitor in this way. So I don't really see them being used in Zarms, especially not in Nano. I'm guessing Yumi's been looking at... You guys have been doing solo Logi's arm fits. I've seen some interesting fits.
Yeah, we do them a lot.
Yeah, so I can definitely see how that's messed around with your capacitor, because if you just threw them into, say, an armor Loki, which I guess is another one you guys have been running, it's you can see them working in a nano armor Loki because you can micromanage the cap and you just have a little bit more burst for those situations where you just need a little extra power to keep someone on field until an enemy dies. But with the Zams, you don't have that. You're bursting all the time. You're burning through the cap all the time because you can't despool, or you're going to lose a lot of your strength. So I don't like them for Zams. For Guardians, obviously, Nano Guardians are not a thing, really, because they rely on the capacitor chain. You need several of them on field. And if you have 2 or more Guardians on field, it gets to a point where you're not running a Nano Gang, you're running an actual fleet. In the armor meta currently, the way that damage is being dealt is creeping towards more than one primary. So you have more than one target caller and more than one damage group in the high-class armor fleets. And it leads to a situation where armor buffer in ships is very important because the Logi is getting overwhelmed and you need the buffer just to give them time to switch their reps between people. So running these instead of slaves in Guardians just won't happen. It's not something that I see us ever doing. And that's not even touching on the fact that a lot of our Guardian pilots are multi-box, and we won't be able to rely on our pilots to micromanage to the extent that these might need you to micromanage to just to keep your capacitor going. So no, I don't see us using these, really.
Yeah, we come to the same conclusion in Volta too. We're a little different because obviously Farah isn't a real wormhole. We can't actually have Citadel, so we can't swap clones very often.
I'm glad to hear someone
and
from
the problem
Farah say
is,
that.
the problem is, right, we have to have like a jump clone timer. So like most of us just have like a slave set for legions. And, you know, like when you're someone who pilots multiple ship types too, right? Like not everyone is just a, you know, only flies logistics. There's a lot of people who, you know, fly a legion, but if we need Logi, they'll swap over. And, you know, slaves are always going to be useful no matter what you're flying in an armor comp generally. Whereas like this set's only useful if you're in a remote repair ship. And even then, like it's very specific on what ships it's going to be useful for.
Yeah, as you've said, it's definitely the biggest issue with them is the fact that they're taking over from a slave or a snake, because the cap penalty, like at least from my perspective, we could just throw a bit more money at our fits and get it to still work, but we can't, you know, get around the fact that a high grade snake pod, everyone has one. It's not a super niche pod, and it still works, you know, wonders on the Logi.
Yeah, pretty much the same. I'm interested, like, I feel like maybe there could be some use for the low grades if they're relatively cheap, for, you know, like, Zams in the smaller applications that I've seen. Like, I can't remember who it was, but in Trigger Happy, we fight people who use a Drekvac plus Zam comp pretty regularly. Seems like one of the times where low-grade slaves wouldn't be worth the cost, but maybe if low-grade saviors sit around the Halo price, they would be really useful because you do want to have the ability to get that second cycle in before another volley comes out. Like, that's the main thing that I can see them being a benefit for, is getting a second cycle off before the next cycle of your opponent's guns.
Yeah, you're you are somewhat. I don't know if you still keep up with like the nullsec fleet, you know, sort of things going on Jin'Taan, but I remember in the CSM summit, Killer B and a lot of FCs were talking about like Munin cycle time on 720s, and if this would drop armor reps down below the cycle time of like the 720s, you get like a second armor cycle off, and then you might actually catch people. I can see maybe that being useful.
Something Muck Barovian posted about a long time ago, and it's a really good post. Everyone should really read it. But it basically points out that with the bonus cycle time that you do get on the Munin, you effectively can't land reps on a armor support ship, and that means that all armor doctrines are inherently incredibly bad against Munins, and that limits your counter options to them. Because the main way you should theoretically be taking on Munins is with shitloads of fucking TDs. That does work. I have actually made that work. I don't know if any of you have seen me somehow managing to kill Munins with Harbingers, but it is entirely possible. The problem that as you scale up, the alpha gets too great for armor support ships to stay on grid because armor recons suck and armor Lokis don't have any range anymore.
Harbingers right into their highest resist. You're playing on hard mode.
I wasn't expecting them to bring Munins. I was like hoping they'd fight me with Feroxes, but then they were cowards. And now they only fight me with AB Munins as well and drop Triage. And I'm like, why?
Yeah,
I'll tell you what just occurred to me while we've been talking about this. This is a very niche use for these implants, but I'm wondering how the remote Repla shack setups that we use for evictions are going to be affected. We just put slaves in them because we all own slaves, but we don't really need the buffer. I wonder, I'm going to have to run the numbers when we're done here. They might actually be good filler shacks. So like we, instead of all the newts in the high slots, we'll put 4 remote medium reps, dead space remote medium reps, just so, because a lot of us are heavily multi-boxing, we don't want to have to lose DPS to put Guardians on field. So we'll see how that works out.
Going to be one of those niche sets. Another real use case that I can see is when you end. I don't know if any of you guys have ever done really small gang logi stuff, but that is my preferred role, or was my preferred role when I actually did small gang. I would be in like an XL ASB fit scimitar, and
yeah, that's what Umi was talking about with his arm fits that they were theory crafting. I believe they run dual prop with an oversized afterburner and a 50mm micro warp drive and glide around grid as a solo logi, just not taking any damage because nobody can apply. It's a fun role. I've done it, I think, once.
Yeah, I think, you can probably see the low grades being useful, but I don't see them being more useful than snakes or more useful than maybe even Nirvanas.
No, I'm sure there's one fit where they're better, but if they just go into the pile of niche implants that just have random effects, it's not the worst thing. Did you, for example, know off the top of your head what Talon implant sets do?
Implant sets, I believe, are the
Kaldari
Kaldari ECCM.
Right?
Yeah, you asked the two worst people to do the trivia questions, teammate.
Well, the only reason that I know the answer to that is because I did a C1 eviction 2 years ago where we were running Basilisks, and Nirvanas weren't a thing. So the only implant set that made sense, because we were going to be shooting a Fortizar, was a bit of extra sensor strength. So we all just brought them with us. And I still own that set. I've not used it again in 2 years. If it falls into that category where it just works for a couple of fits and somebody comes up with a crazy fit and for whatever reason this implant set makes that crazy fit work, that's not a bad thing. It just means nobody's going to be making much money out of them.
Yeah.
I think it's terrible.
This might be a bit better for like casual no-sec players, because we all know no-sec players are not nearly as hardcore as wormholers, right?
Of course,
generally,
no. Of course,
like, it's a lot easier for you to tell like 4 or 5 guardians to buy a savior set than it is for you to tell like 50 people to buy slaves.
No, that's fair.
Yeah, it's pretty much impossible to get a large. Like I've thought for the longest time, for about 5 years, that the next development in, because we went through the point of like, oh, there's no way that you could ever reliably field a faction battleship fleet, and then people did it, and then we're like, well, there's no way that people could reliably field an entire fleet of pirate battleships, and then everyone did it, and then we were like, there's no way everyone can just field an entire fleet of super capitals, and then everyone just did it. So the next logical extension from that, from my perspective, was always like everyone saying, well, there's no way that you could get everyone to use the correct implants and to have like a standardized implant set. And it turns out that's just correct, because there's pretty much no way to check it, unfortunately.
Well, I mean,
Eventually
Snuff and
we will get
Wormhole groups have been doing it for a while, right? Like Snuff had a lot of mid-grade slave, had like a mid-grade slave requirement, if I remember correctly. Like most wormholers probably running at least mid-grade slaves.
Yeah, totally, and that's part of where it came from, because I know that Snuffed and a lot of those low-sec groups normally were at the forefront of doctrine development, and I saw that coming through.
For us, it was because we were so excited to have the Citadels and just to be able to use implants for the first time in 2016. Because you couldn't use slaves in wormhole space before 2016, because what if you wanted to roam out on nullsec? Like you'd have to either have dedicated characters for armor and then dedicated for nullsec nano, or when somebody rolled into your home for an armor fight, you'd need to agree that everybody gets half an hour to burn out a high sec to pick up their slave implants. It was ridiculous. Nobody ran implants, so everyone was so excited when Citadels came out that everybody bought slaves, and then you just throw in a bit of SRP and nobody ever gets rid of them.
We've also got to appreciate that people in Stuff, people in Hard Knocks, Wormholes, these people generally are more invested in, trying to help out to win any way possible. Whereas, the average Goonswarm test line member, they're not really too invested in the actual fate.
I think you would be surprised, but yeah, I think it's
It's difficult without the mindset. Coming back to Wormholes being more elite than nullsec, the perspective is very difficult. It wouldn't surprise me if a typical nullsec line member was better at Eve than the typical Wormhole player, simply because they have more practice. Wormhole content is just rarer by definition of living in Wormhole space. And just the more experience nullsec players get, just will make them better players statistically. So we definitely lose some perspective there on how different groups play.
All right. Well, to get off the nullsec versus Wormholes circle jerk, let's talk about the latest tier side to hit EVE Online. And unlike the last couple of them, this is one that actually has pretty significant theory crafting implications. And that is the tier side for remote capacitor transfers, or cap transfers, as most people would call them. And I won't go through the gory details again of, here is what modules turned into what module, but we now have Tech 1, Scoped, and Compact. And the most important thing, and the reason why I say this has theory crafting implications, is that all of the new Compact cap transfers have the power grid requirements that storyline cap transfers previously had, and storyline cap transfers have been shifted even further down in fitting. This is it's not a huge change, but it is a significant one, because a lot of the time for things like, especially Guardians, are the big one that pops to mind for me, the limitation on what tank you could fit was due to power grid. Most people's Guardians either had 1 or 2 Ansil fits, and that might now have changed. I don't have an updated Python to fiddle around with yet, but this seems like it could significantly change both those Basilisks, Ospreys, and I guess in theory Auguras, but literally who the hell uses Auguras in the year of our Lord 2020?
So just firing up Python out of curiosity, the Hard Knocks Guardian fit is 4 large remote reps with sort of 2 T2 and 2 meta, just for the sake of fitting, and then the 2 cap transfers. So we do have a little bit fitting left over, and it looks like we will be able to switch to using full T2 large reps rather than mixing T2 and meta. As far as tank goes, we run a syndicate plate. I'm sure most people will probably run tungsten because they don't want to pay 120 mil for a Guardian plate. And I see that I am ever so slightly short of being able to upgrade that to a better plate. I'm 3 power grid off with this fit, and I'm sure there'll be a way to move some modules around here to get that 3 power grid. So yes, you'd be able to get a little bit more tank out of it, or you'd be able to fit the quad T2 large reps if this is a dual and Silphid. So yes, there are some small changes there. I don't really know, because the capacitor transfer amount of the compact is lower compared to the old transfers that we used to use, which were the Rigard, the Meta 4s. So they might have been the Meta 3s actually. So I'm wondering how less stable Guardian chains are now compared to how they used to be.
They'll probably be completely fine, because large transfers just generated so much capacitor once you had Logi 5, the bonuses you got were ridiculous.
You are probably right. I'm wondering if there'll be any effect at all on how Guardian chains run under heavy Balgron newts. So we'll see there. I can think of 2 comps that will be affected by the reduce in amount. The first one, Yumi might be able to tell us more about, which was something I've heard referred to as troikas, which is where you would have a group of Leshaks all fit with remote capacitor transmitters, all feeding one Leshak, and all feeding one Nester, and the Nester would be max large remote rep fit. And because the Nester is one of the only ships in the game with a remote rep amount bonus, not even Guardian has that, it just does a huge amount of remote rep. It's one of the more powerful Logi ships in the game. And the last time I ran that through Python, it was so tight that I believe you needed to run specific implants just to get the cycle time out of the capacitor transmitters. I think you needed to run you definitely needed the energy emissions implant, and you needed something else as well. I can't remember what. I'm wondering whether that still works. I know you guys don't run it much anymore, but have you looked at those numbers?
I haven't actually looked myself, but we don't actually talk about that comp that much.
Oh, that's a shame. It looked like a really fun comp,
yeah.
But I guess it doesn't work in
our comps that our secretish comps we don't really talk about, you know.
That's fair, but I'm not sure if that will work anymore. I'll have to do the numbers myself. The second thing that might not work anymore is going back to high-class PvE with the rattlesnakes that I mentioned earlier that were so dependent on capacitor that they'd have to feed remote cap to each other. And they would use egress rigs, which were a rig that reduces the capacitor requirement for newts and cap transmitters. They'd require them, and they'd be able to chain just like Guardians do. They'd need 5 or 6 remote capacitor transmitters just to keep their shield booster going. And I think this amount, combined with the newts, with the energy newts that Sleepers apply to them during sight, it might actually harm them to the point that they need to change fits or maybe even add an extra ship.
Another really minor thing is that the range is reduced now too from the regard if you're using the compact. I don't think it'll matter for Guardians because your range is so high and you're always going to be on top of each other. And the Shacks do have the double or triple range bonus, I believe it is, on the whole. But it might be relevant for PvE, maybe. I know they kind of just sit on each other though, so I don't know.
It won't be relevant at all. They don't typically move at all. You just warp in and, you know, press the reboot command, get them orbiting yourself.
I hate
because I know going back to like the Alliance tournament, like bumping the Tinker setup outside of like command ship remote energy transfer range was like one of the major big things you could do to like kill that comp. So like maybe bumping something out of energy transfer range is a little easier now, but this is like super like weird theory crafting shit.
I'm trying to think of something on Tranquility that requires capacitor transmitters that doesn't have the bonus to range. I'm drawing a blank. I bet there's something somewhere. I can't think of anything.
It's the rest ships, I believe. They don't have a range bonus. They have an activation cost, as far as I'm aware.
Oh, I think you
might be
right,
completely
actually.
wrong.
I think you're right. I'm going to double check.
Yeah,
that.
It's the reps that have a range bonus, I believe.
I will say that I personally just massively invested in Chivalry large remote capacitor transmitters after I saw this patch, because they got a huge buff compared to everything else, especially the compacts, because they did not have their stats changed at all.
You guys are correct. You guys are correct. The range bonus only applies to remote armor repairer range.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised to see the new fits that you guys develop for like Wormholes, because obviously Wormholes, historically, we'll have to see how things play out with the new C6 changes, I suppose, have always wanted to run more expensive doctrines and had access to the wealth to make their doctrines particularly as good as they can be. You know, I've always seen X-types and things like that on Wormhole ships, and I imagine you guys will probably switch to Chivalries because they're now just flat out better in every way than a compact and T2.
I am just running the numbers, but with our current fit, you have the choice of either going for better remote rep or better local tank. You cannot do both, even with shift. 7.8 power grid over. Okay, I bet there's a way to do this, but no, I don't think it's doable.
Okay, no worries. Well, I'm sure we can figure that out in Python in the months to come, and I can't wait for that because I love it when these tier sides actually do impact the meta in some ways. You know, the previous ones we've just seen were the changes to local armor and shield reppers, and those had. I don't know. Can you talk about that at all, Suitonia? Did those have any impact on what fits you were using? I imagine not.
No, not really. I mean, the only real difference was that I think they buffed the fitting on the Cosmos shield boosters, but they were like super niche and no one really used them anyway. It might like enable like some really weird like Hawk fit or something. I don't know. But for the medium armor repair, the like armor repairs, I believe only the medium and the large compact ones got dropped down to the old storyline value, but no one's really going to use them anyway. So I don't think it will really make much of an impact. But there are some interesting things maybe that could come from it.
Yeah, the bottleneck for local reps was never the fitting. It was a lot more to do with the what's it called?
The ancillary armor reps are just so much better, or like X type.
You either fit the dead space or you fit the ancillary, especially with shield. I don't think I've ever seen somebody use.
You can probably abyss. Yeah. Oh, okay. You've looked at abyssaling it. Yeah, we can talk about this later. Yeah.
Yeah, we can.
Alright, so we have one final real major change. Oh no, two final major changes. The first is the new UI stuff. The red dot of doom, etc, etc. I personally have been playing around with this and I don't really care. It doesn't really impact my life at all. The only thing that I've really noticed that I liked was the actual addition of 1,000 separators, because this means I don't create contracts 2 people for 60 billion ISK when I meant to type 6, which happens a lot. That's about it.
That's nice.
I am wondering how much of the inventory notification is even intended. It feels very overwhelming right now. As an example, I was messing around with some PvP fits earlier, and I got a notification when I moved some cat boosters from a container into my ship's active hangar. It was just...
I've also been getting notifications when people move stuff around the corp hangars. It's very buggy.
I think a lot of it's unintended. I remember when I logged into Singularity just as they put it up after the extended Singularity downtime, and the first thing I did was scan some wormholes, and I noticed I got the item sound every time I pulled my probes, which I believe they fixed.
You still get that.
You really still get
that? If you jump a hole with your probes up, you get...
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think it's just very buggy. I don't think the annoyance is intended. I think they just need another week of QA.
Yeah, that it feels like that happens a lot of the time, but I would rather CCP actually launch patches on a regular scale, and maybe sometimes some things aren't particularly well QA'd. That's my perspective, because we just went through a stage in 2019 where it just felt like there was no changes to the game.
I think you're probably right. I think with something as trivial as this, just getting out there and getting the players to do the bug reports, something that's just not very impactful at all like this, that's probably a better idea than keeping it in QA for an extra week.
Yeah, I definitely like it for just buying stuff in Jita, that kind of stuff, because you don't accidentally carry out, a handful of useless.
I imagine it's really good for cargo contract as well, when somebody just delivers something to you and suddenly it's all over your item hangar, all over whatever you were doing.
Mm-hmm. Then we have the Hypernet changes. All right, we are done with our conversation on the Hypernet changes. And then we get on to the really, really interesting one, and that is the adjustments of various ore fields in the game. And from what I've seen, especially from CSM members like Sword Dragon, the numbers that were released onto TQ were the intended numbers. So when they say reduced, this is like a 3 to 4 times reduction, basically. You are now looking at a massive reduction in the availability of ore in EVE Online overall.
Well, the biggest change really is that they reduced the size of the rocks, right? So it's significantly harder to just park a rockle there for like 20 minutes at a time per rock, or 30, 40 minutes if you're talking about the larger moon rocks that haven't been changed yet, but there is a dev blog on that, but I think you'll probably cover that at another time.
Yeah, in addition to that, we have all of the Sov Index anomaly respawn times have been massively increased, so you have to move systems a lot more with your rock core if you're just anomaly mining. We've got a lot of mineral distribution changes, and what this reads like to me is probably not what CCP wants the final layout to be, because it's a lot of nerfs to specifically ABCs in nullsec, and that to me doesn't seem like the way they'd want it to be in the end game, but is what they're doing right now, because the game has been absolutely fucking flooded with ABCs for so long that there needs to be a shortening in that market for the mineral prices to start to recover. Because right now your bottlenecks are primarily titanium and then a sidebar of Mexilon. And all the high ends, you just have enough of them that you don't really worry about it. Like that's what you export to high sec so that you can get titanium back.
Yeah, and if you actually look at the changes here, so in high sec, Pyroxis, Umbra, and Kernite have been reduced, but those specifically have Isogen and Mexilon in them. In low sec, there's a lot of stuff, but generally speaking, we're also seeing the same thing, Isogen and Mexilon being reduced. What's interesting is they also reduced Feldspar, Scordite, and stuff, but I don't know if low sec rockles were actually a thing, but...
They were. They absolutely were. Not huge, but they did exist. But again, like I said, it's hitting the stuff that has been absolutely tanked. So Kernite and Umber, those are isogen-fueled ores, and those are not good ores. Like Umber specifically has been the worst ore to mine in the game for about basically since 2016, 2015. It used to be
ever
somewhat
since
good.
the Rockle came out.
Yeah, but because of the massive spike in Isogen onto the market, Ombre just dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped because it is primarily an Isogen-producing mineral. So by cutting the supply of Isogen out of the game literally everywhere, what you're doing is you're allowing the Isogen stockpiles to be depleted over the mid to long term. It won't happen right now because the stockpiles are just so huge that you're not going to see that happen. You know, people are sitting on hundreds and hundreds of billions of ore in Jitter. Like, I personally have over 50 billion ISK of ore in Jitter that I'm just sitting on. Yeah, we also had the big dev blog about the future of Athanors. You know, when I originally read through these patches, I was like, okay, those are good changes, but as long as Athanors exist in their current state, this isn't going to do anything. And I mentioned that in my patch notes video, and then about an hour after I put it up, CCP released that dev blog, and I was a little salty about that, I won't lie. But I'm looking forward to trying to analyse that in more detail over the coming days. We said that we weren't going to talk about that here. But yeah, do you guys have any opinions on this, really?
Not really.
None that would be any better than your typical null brain spewing in token in stations. I really have no expertise here that'd be valuable, I'm afraid.
Basically, just the oracles are going to be there, I guess.
It
Yeah,
is going to suck a little bit for
nothing's-
whaling, at least initially. There's going to be less people out in space, which is never a good thing for us. But with any luck, that'll change.
I think you'll see the same amount of people in space. It's just that they'll be more concentrated on Athanors for the next 2 to 3 months.
That's a good point. So I need to remember to warp to moons instead of warping to Oranoms for the next 3 months.
Yeah.
Combat probes it is.
That's a good point, actually.
You can guesstimate the fracking times as well. So this is something that's going to make... It's going to basically make it so that everyone that doesn't already have a mass moon farm is probably screwed. So, like, the main thing that I saw from this when I was initially taking my read is like, okay, so CCP's trying to make it so that when you take a region, it takes longer to get it up to speed industrially. So you can't have something like what we saw in Oasa, where, Fraternity lost a war, moved to a new area of space, and literally within a week they were just rockwool farming to the max capacity, and they were instantly replacing all their losses. And that made a bit of sense to me as well, because it meant that something like the glassing of the North would be relatively impactful from a strategic standpoint. You can actually, it's always something you want to take with a grain of salt when you hear the Mittani say that something's important, but the fact that he does say something is important is a data point you need to pay attention to. And one of the things he was consistently bragging about as a success of the operation was the fact that even if NC Dot and PL moved back into that space, they would now have to wait 60 days for their Athanors to recycle for them to get the max value out of it. And that is a very good point, and something that made that strategically important already. But this made it so that it almost wasn't... This change here makes it so it almost wasn't worth going back and recolonizing that space until you had those cycles completed, in terms of providing industrial output.
I think that's one of the few wars since Citadel was introduced where the structures died before any actual PvP happened. Well, without any actual PvP happening. I'm thinking back to the only nullsec war I participated in the last 3 years, which was the drone war, and our time aboard was fairly clean right up until the surrender, and then suddenly we were at 30 timers a day with all of the structures.
Yeah, that war was very interesting and weird.
It's unfortunately my only frame of reference, so I don't have much insight into a typical nullsec war.
Mm-hmm. I will say
it
that
also has some.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just saying it might have some implications on the high sec shortage of Isogen too, with Ombre and Kernite going away, because a lot of people are probably going to be hesitant about putting up like an Ombre or Kernite Athanor in 0.5 in high sec if it's going to get nerfed by the time your 60-day cycle comes around for it.
I'm sorry, I do need to leave. Something's just come up, but thank you for having me, guys.
No worries, we're just about to wrap it up anyway, so
excellent.
Thank you all for listening.
Take off right now, then.
And thank you for coming along, Loroseco and uMillenium.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Alright, well, thank you for listening, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day, and as always, fly smart.